Thank you for a fascinating and passionate discussion. Just one quick question before we get on with our next segment. Have your apps ready, please. We all know that digitization is a great opportunity for innovation and competitiveness, but it also comes with some concerns, and we've been talking about some of these this morning. So I wanted to ask you, what worries you most about the digital transition? Is it the impact on jobs or employment? Is it the risk of economic concentration, data privacy and security, and implications for liberal democracy? We will talk about all these issues this morning. We've already started, but please do vote, because I think it's interesting to know what the audience is feeling about these things. And I hope the app is working well this time. We have results. Good. Data privacy is the first one. Liberal democracy, employment, and concentration. So lots of concerns, but definitely one is an important one, and that's homework for the next panel and speakers. The next segment is actually called Building Trust in Data, so it can't be more appropriate. And we will start with a presentation by Glen, the founder of RadicalxChange Foundation and political economist and social technologist in the office of Microsoft's CTO. He will introduce some of the challenges, and then he will be part of a dialogue led by Santander's Chief Data Officer, Cristina San Jose, and joined by Diego Rubio from IE. Please, Glen. Thank you.
So I think that the challenges that we're facing in trust around data really go back to the culture that gave birth to the internet, which was really a collaboration between a bunch of institutions where trust was really not a major problem. You had the military, which has a very, very close-knit culture with high degrees of discipline. You had hippies and the counterculture coming out of the Bay Area that influenced, through its sort of communal attitude, the early internet. And you had a bunch of academics. All of these were cultures with very high trust, very close personal relationships. And so as the internet began to build up from these different networks connecting to each other, there was very little focus on building the infrastructure for long-distance trust across people who were not closely socially connected to each other. Things like identity cards or identity certificates, money, other things that we use to interact with people that we don't know were not built into the structure of the internet. Thank you. And what stepped in to make up for this gap in the underlying sort of network of networks conception that was the internet, this lack of this trust infrastructure, was of course the platforms. Platforms like Google provided notion of which websites you should trust, what information you should trust, et cetera. Identity was provided by platforms like Google and Facebook with their single login infrastructure. And payments infrastructure were provided by platforms like PayPal and increasingly recently by some of these cryptocurrency adventures, et cetera. The problem with this approach, unfortunately, was that trust has always relied upon a variety of diffuse, intermediate scale social institutions. Things like churches, unions, investigative journalists, universities, researchers. These are the institutions that provide the infrastructure that the state alone, and certainly not atomized individuals, can provide for trust. The state or giant platforms don't have the capacity to provide the institutionalized belief systems that allow us to trust various information. States cannot just engage in censorship, determining what things are true or not, that doesn't lead to a diverse, pluralistic society. That doesn't lead actually to the advance of quality. And all the institutions that did provide that really had the economics sucked out of them by platforms that had a very strong rhetoric of artificial intelligence and a business model associated with that of being extremely labor light. And the journalists, all the individual data providers who were actually fueling that, all had the economics taken out of them by a rhetoric and a business model of concentrating all of the authority and the economic power associated with that into these few platforms. And yet, I think we've seen in recent years that that artificial intelligence-driven model doesn't really deliver quite what it promised. So we've seen the proliferation of fake news, of disinformation, precisely under the governance of these allegedly objective and efficient vehicles for conveying truth. We've seen the increase of addiction and capture of our attention by organizations that we don't want to be drawing our focus. We've seen that while allegedly data just appears and fuels artificial intelligence, it's just some natural resource like oil. In fact, most of the data that is leading to automation and artificial intelligence is created by work that each of us is doing every day, many times without being aware of it. So there's a great cartoon that you can't quite see here probably in the upper left there from XKCD, so I'll read it to you. It shows a little picture of a stop sign, and it says, in order to complete your registration for this website, please identify whether this image contains a stop sign. Please do it within the next 3 seconds as our self-driving car is approaching the intersection. So whenever you're signing up on these websites, you have to do these, identify street signs, identify crosswalks. Those are actually training the artificial intelligence systems that are allegedly replacing your job. And similarly, we saw that in Myanmar, Facebook ended up largely inadvertently fueling a genocide because it had a model of not relying on the civil society institutions, not economically empowering the institutions on which it actually depends. Now, luckily, despite that attempt to suck all of the economics out of these other sectors, despite the fact that Facebook, Google, the digital economy have the lowest labor share of any sectors in the economy other than the extractive industries, about 10%, there is still a growing attempt to build a civil society within the digital sector that can actually make up for the roles that have been hollowed out by these platform models. There's civil society organizations like Avaz. There's a number of very interesting emerging attempts to build investigative journalism, like the Independent Journal Review. The Center for Humane Technology is trying to give people the tools to regain control over their attention and the direction they want their lives to take, roles that used to be played by things like churches. There's attempts within the blockchain space to build up a new set of payment infrastructures that are not so dependent on a few platform players. There's groups like the Web of Trust Foundation that are trying to build different pluralistic paths for trust. And there's a growing movement that I'm particularly excited about of data labor unionism that are trying to form data trusts, data cooperatives, other democratic institutions for governing and ensuring the rewards from data come back to the people who are actually doing the work to produce it. So to just give you a relevant, hopefully, contrast of potential approaches here, compare the credit scoring type approach, which is based on data analytics, gathering data largely without people's knowledge, and trying to use that as the primary foundation of issuing loans, and maybe the most extreme version of that is the attempt to spread that more broadly throughout society, as in the Chinese credit scoring system, versus approaches like the Grameen Bank and other more sophisticated forms of network-based lending, which actually use social proof and social relations and sort of the variety of paths that flows through as ways of underlying a relationship and actually spreading the notion of a relationship-based banking. Those approaches, I would contend, actually add more information, and even beyond information, they add more pathways for having a foundation for that trust to be valid, because you are relying on the social fabric that people want to maintain for a variety of purposes to underlie that relationship. So rather than hollowing everything out, turning everything into a purely AI-driven perspective on data, instead realizing that data is created by a variety of social relationships, and that if you have credit flow through those social relationships, it's actually a more secure foundation. And that can very much be empowered by information technology. Information technology is a perfect foundation for that, but not if we forget about the humans that it's actually connecting. And to build a world, to build a genuinely pluralistic world that we can trust for data, requires a variety of different approaches to intertwine with each other. It requires new regulations and new institutions. So for example, we've been working on building legislation to support data cooperatives and data trusts. It requires new technologies that allow for the transmission of that information, such as the intersectional social data structure that we've been working on. It requires new organizations and entrepreneurial institutions to emerge, like these data unions and these civil society organizations I was talking about. And it requires citizen activism to become aware of the way in which data value is being expropriated and being held away from the organizations that are actually creating that value, those variety of third sector institutions that Mariana was referring to, which have always been, in a pluralistic society, the repositories of the most important trust. So I'm looking forward to discussing this more with the panel.